Hello, I'd like to continue our look at polls by addressing something that has been, really the biggest talked about issue in terms of polling, and that is what supposedly, right, happened in the 2016 and 2020 presidential election polls, where if you're thinking, gosh, polling is just silly, or, if you're thinking polling is just great, what happened in these last couple of elections has really formed a kind of a narrative about what's really gone on, the usefulness of polling and pollsters, etc. And so the narrative, if you go all the way back to the election of 2016, was that all the polls were wrong because they said Trump had no chance and instead he won. Okay, that's you see that in the media time after time after time. You can probably find 200 different media articles whose titles say maybe that very thing. Okay, so there are two elements of the narrative that really deserve examination. One of those elements is the presentation of polling data in forecasts, right? That is how people used polling data to try and anticipate the results of the 2016 election before it happened. And we should also take a look at the actual versus the predicted poll results, like what the poll results perhaps would have predicted versus what actually happened. And so first off, let's talk a little bit about the presentation of polling data in forecasts. Now this is just a sampling, okay, of some of what some of the polls said leading up to in the very last days of the 2016 presidential election. And the first thing to keep in mind here is that these are all forecasts. So the Upshot is a forecast, PredictWise is a forecast. The Princeton Electoral Commission was in the business of forecasting, and so is 538 over here, with several different kinds of forecast models that they had deployed. And keep in mind that a poll and a forecast are not the same thing. A poll aims to supply an accurate state of a race at the time that that poll is collected. In other words, it is intended to be a snapshot of the present. A forecast, on the other hand, is an estimation of the probabilities of future events. Okay, so a pollster will regard their work as done if what they did was reflect the way that a particular race was at the time when they collected the poll. Now the polls, the sort of the latest polls, right? The polls that are sort of up to the very last minute of a major election are the ones that you want to try and compare, right? To see, how close they got to the actual result. But even that's only sort of close. If a poll might be perfectly correct and yet say the wrong thing if people change their mind between the time the poll happened and the time the election happened, right? I mean, that's logically possible, at least, even if it doesn't tend to happen a whole heck of a lot. So again, keep in mind a difference between a poll and a forecast. They're both very different things. And while we're on forecasts, which are supposed to tell you about the probabilities of future events or the chance of future events, we should take a minute to reflect on the way that people tend to both report and perceive things about probability and chance. Okay. Even something like 80% is not anywhere close to certain. But psychologically, people tend to treat probabilities that are north of around 80% as if they were certain. Like they just, they just say, oh, well, that's take it to the bank. Okay. And when you think about it more carefully, that's not the case, right? So just as a thought experiment, imagine that I were to kick you in the shins on average, 1 out of every 5 times I walk past you. Right? It's not exactly every fifth time, but like on average, 1 out of every 5 times I walk past you, I kick you in the shins. Okay, that means 80% of the time I don't. Okay, so do you just like walk by me the next time with the idea that I'm just certain not to kick you in the shins? Right. In fact, if I've ever kicked you in the shins walking by you, you're going to be wary. You're going to say, again, even if it's 95%, 99%, this is just, it's silly to treat these kinds of probabilities as certainties, but people tend to. They tend to read them that way, even though that's not at all how they would react to those kinds of probabilities in reality. For example, if you see on the previous Nate Silver's model, the 538 model, was much more sensitive than most models to uncertainty in a close election, and it gave Trump a 1 in 3 chance of winning based on the polling data that they saw. and that's, they caught a lot of flack for that, and I think perhaps they can maybe be a little bit vindicated. But again, you'd rather have a 2 out of 3 chance than a 1 out of 3 chance, but a 1 out of 3 chance is a real chance. And so this idea that, of the narrative said that, well, polls all said that there was no chance there. That's not really true. One of the things that's interesting is the way that a lot of folks went about presenting the probabilities here. So what this chart is it's a reflection of what's called a Monte Carlo, right? Which is where what you do is you take the probabilities, right, that you estimate for certain things, and then you just run a bunch of simulations, right? Thousands, tens of thousands, whatever, and then you just sort of track what ends up happening. Right. And so if you wanted to know, what the general odds of rolling, say, a pair of ones on a pair of dice are, the snake eyes, right? Well, then one thing you could do was you could roll a pair of dice 10,000 times and just record all your results. And then at the end of it, you can just sort of look to see, what happened, right? And so for any really complex system, that tends to be a fairly good way to go. And so what this is a kind of Monte Carlo simulation on the basis of the polls. Right? They use the polling data to say, all right, let's assume that the poll is, is this sort of a range. This is the percentage of the time that the range is within the poll's margin of error. And so they take all those polls and in all those different areas and all the different states, and they just sort of essentially simulate the election 10,000 times or something like that. And what they're left with are all these different outcomes. And here's how many times, imagine an outcome is just like one little dot. You stack them all up, and the stacks that are higher are outcomes that came up more frequently. Stacks that are lower are outcomes that came up less frequently. So you see here less frequent outcomes, here more frequent outcomes, here the most frequent outcomes. But even these individual outcomes only have a couple of % chances of actually happening because they're just some out of all of the many possibilities. And so this tried to show in a Monte Carlo simulation how much overlap, right, there is between the kinds of scenarios in which Clinton would win that election and Trump would win that election, given that it was forecast to be a fairly close election. And it was a very close election by any measure except the popular vote. Right. So here is the way that the New York Times presented the same information. And again, you'll see it's kind of the result of a Monte Carlo, although it seems sort of stretched in this direction to make it really look like all of this all these blue outcomes here, right? These outcomes that would have resulted in a Clinton victory in that election were just so much bigger than these little red ones over here. And to some extent, I think that made people think that, the New York Times was representing, a much greater chance of a Clinton victory than some of the other models. And they in fact were, right? And so those appearances might have been sort of accurate to what the thinking was by the people running this particular forecast. However, if you change the way that these are presented, I mean, in fact, this is a chart that was published in the Washington Post a few weeks after the election of 2016, where they said, look, if you presented the chances as a risk characterization theater, which is in a sense like if you just look at like the seat map of a like an opera house or a concert theater, something like that. The idea is that each of these the black seats represents a Trump victory in your simulation. Each of the white seats represents a Clinton victory in your simulation. Now, of course, different forecasters had different ideas about this. So HuffPost's pollster thought there was very little, as you can see, chance of a Trump victory, whereas New York Times' upshot that obviously showed there was considerably more. Then by the time you get to 538's model, which again tended to give Trump the best chances of the major forecast models, you see it's not that unlikely at all, really. I mean, so what are the chances that if you just draw a random ticket to or scalp a random ticket that you're going to get one of the black seats versus one of the white seats here that are in this chart? So again, this is a way of representing risk that people tend to sort of intuitively understand somewhat better than numbers or Monte Carlo graphs. And so perhaps presenting risks differently as one of these risk characterization theaters instead of as sets of abstract bar graphs, maybe people actually get a better idea of probabilities that way. And so certainly people in the media have a lot to think about in terms of presenting information about probability more effectively. And in fact, some of the people at 538, who again is generally well regarded as an election and polling analyst, they don't do polling themselves; they analyze polls. they have, in subsequent elections, really tried to more effectively communicate probability. Um, and in fact, so if you see over here, this is a forecast from the midterm elections in 2018 about whether or not Democrats or Republicans would end up controlling the House. Now, you see they still have this nice sort of Monte Carlo graph here, but they've labeled a lot of pieces of it. So they say, like, here's the average, here's the median, here's the 80% chance area, right? This is all of the most likely outcomes, and you see among the most likely outcomes, almost all of them have the Democrats gaining control of the House of Representatives. They said that had a 7 in 8 chance of happening. So notice instead of a percentage chance or just a graph, they also added these kind of odds, right? Believing that people would understand that better, and perhaps people do. In reality, the Democrats gained, I think, 42 or 43 seats, and so their projection was the middle of their projection was very, very close. And then, of course, in the last presidential election, notice this is a very different presentation altogether. They've kept the kind of odds here, right, and sort of like 10 and 100 versus 89 and 100, right? And they've sort of shown these little balls, essentially, as a kind of, well, here's, if we run the simulation, again, we simulate the election 40,000 times to see who wins most often. The sample of 100 outcomes below gives you a good idea of the range of scenarios, right, that the model churns out. And you see if most of those scenarios go one way as opposed to another, then that gives you some chance. It doesn't mean that there's no chance of an upset, right? In fact, they have their little mascot 5e Fox over here just saying, hey, look, don't count the underdog out, right? That's just to drive home. Probabilities are just probabilities. If your weather forecaster forecasts a 90% chance of rain and it doesn't rain, that doesn't mean the forecast was wrong. That's something you have to sort of get used to in terms of chance and risk. In fact, one of the things that this is just a sort of a capture of an image, but this was very interactive. If you sort of hovered your mouse over one of these little dots, it would show you the electoral map that generated that outcome. And in fact, I believe it was this one here that was turned out to be the actual result, right? So just in case you were curious. And one more thing to say is you might have noticed, again, a number of slides ago when we talked about all those forecast models, that the 538 model had percentages in the 60s, the New York Times model had percentages in the 80s, and the Princeton Electoral Commission, the PEC, had a forecast that said 100%, right? One of the things that happened was that a lot of people looked at some of these forecasts, they looked at some of the polling data, and they sort of, inferred from it a lot more certainty than was really in that data. And that's actually something that's very common among people that you see on TV, that is so-called political experts, or pundits as they might be called. I would recommend to you a really excellent book about this, about forecasting, especially political events. The book is called Expert Political Judgment, and it's by a social scientist by the name of Philip Tetlock. And what he does is, he actually spends, a couple of decades of research, doing experiments about how well people predict political events, and how well political experts specifically do in predicting political events, right? It's a very, very thoroughly scientifically tested, and it's kind of a difficult, fairly technical book to read, but it's still very much worth the time it takes to get through it. And so this is the summary from the publisher. It says he first discusses arguments about whether the world is too complex for people to find the tools to understand political phenomena, let alone predict the future. He finds that the world is not too complex for that, at least at some reasonable level. He evaluates predictions from experts in different fields, comparing them to predictions by well-informed laity or those based on simple extrapolation from current trends. He goes on to analyze which styles of thinking are more successful in forecasting, that is, prove themselves to be more successful forecasters, right? To actually get it right more often and in greater degrees than they get it wrong. Classifying these thinking styles using Isaiah Berlin's prototypes of the fox and the hedgehog. Right, this is an old essay that a guy named Isaiah Berlin wrote, where he talked about there being a couple of different types of thinkers, right? One of those being a fox, another being a hedgehog, right? The fox is somebody who knows lots of little things. The hedgehog knows one big thing, right? It's a very interesting essay. I'd recommend reading that essay. But Tetlock contends that the fox, right, this is a nice metaphor that he uses throughout, the thinker who knows many little things, draws from an eclectic array of traditions and is better able to improvise in response to changing events. Is more successful in predicting the future than the hedgehog is, who knows one big thing, toils devotedly within one tradition, and imposes formulaic solutions on ill-defined problems. He notes a perversely inverse relationship between the best scientific indicators of good judgment and the qualities that the media most prizes in pundits, the single-minded determination required to prevail in ideological combat. It's a great summary of what the book is and does. To put it another way, the kinds of personalities that succeed on TV are the kind that are very much more hedgehoggy in this sense, right? They tend to sort of, kind of apply the same sort of a procedure. They kind of have a go-to method, right? And that's the sort of thing, they never back off of a claim, right? They don't show any nuance, right? These are the kind of things that tend to look really good on TV. But if you want to look at the sorts of mental habits that really lead to provably better forecasting, there's a lot more nuance, a lot more uncertainty, a lot more, flip-floppiness, a lot more, willingness to sort of change and adapt. Those are the sorts of things that lead to much better predictions. And those are things that are, common among people who just don't look very good on TV, right? To say, gee, I wonder, on the one hand this, on the other hand that, right? That's not the kind of thing that looks good on TV, right? On TV, you want somebody to pound on the table and just say, I know the way it is, right? Be very, very confident instead of very unconfident, very uncertain, and very, critical in a sense. So, again, this is a work I'd highly recommend. And I think there's also a little bit of another piece of influence here. If you look at the logo for the 538 website, you'll notice it looks suspiciously fox-like. And I'm almost certain that there's a connection between the two. So let's talk about then the actual polling accuracy aside from the narrative that happened in 2016 in that presidential election. So, for example, if you look at some projections of the popular vote margin, the 538 predicted that Donald Trump would get about 45.4% of the total popular vote and predicted that Clinton would get 48.4%. Election projections website projected the popular vote as being 46.6 to 48.4. And the actual result was that Trump got 46.1% of the popular vote and Clinton got 48.2%. So if you want to say, how did these projections do? I think you'd have to say they did pretty well forecasting the popular vote, which means that the polls that they based their projection on were generally pretty good. And in fact, if you look after the fact, right, if you look at, sort of comparing the 2016 election cycle to previous election cycles, here, again, this is from 538's page. You can see their sort of logo there that looks in one sense like a pencil, right, and in one sense like a fox, right. You see that sort of the both, when you combine sort of national and state errors and, you look at combined, you're looking at a slightly higher error than you had in 2012 or 2008 or even 2004, but very similar to 2000, right? Very similar to 1988 and 84. In fact, much smaller than in 1980. And so if you average all that together, they're actually, right about average, right? The polls in 2016 were about average. They were about as good / bad as they always are in presidential cycles. And so let's turn our attention to judging some of these forecasts then, and think about let's think about how to judge a forecast first of all. So again, imagine if the forecast for tomorrow shows a 75% chance of rain and it does not rain. The question is, was the forecast wrong? Well, that's just a really difficult question to answer, right? Just because it doesn't rain, just because the 25% chance of thing happened, doesn't mean that there wasn't really a 75% chance of rain. And so it's really hard to evaluate. Everybody likes to evaluate a prediction in terms of right or wrong, right? And this is the way that people tend to like to evaluate lots of things, right? People evaluate, athletic coaches, political leaders, teachers, right? They what they do is they put them on sort of a genius or idiot category, and they can be sort of moved from one box to the other, but hardly ever anywhere in between, and hardly with any nuance. And that's the way people sort of like it, but that's not exactly the most effective and accurate way of thinking about the world. Certainly not a forecast. If we judge forecasts that way, well, then what we do is we paint ourselves into the corner of having to say that improbable things never happen, right? So to say, well, look, there's only a 1 in 6 chance of rolling a 6 on that die. That's improbable. And then, you roll it, like you get a 6. You're like, that's so improbable. That's not, yeah, it happens sometimes. Right. So, for example, if you want to you look at forecasts and probabilistic models, in 2008, the University of Kansas men's basketball team had a 1.9% chance of winning the national championship game. They were down 9 points to Memphis with just over 2 minutes left in the game. And again, teams in that situation, down 9 points with about 2 minutes left, only win about 1.9% of the time. Well, as it happens, KU won that game. Does that mean that 1.9% win probability number was bogus? Well, no. It just means that sometimes improbable things do happen. And that's just, something you always have to keep in mind when judging any forecast that didn't happen to show the more probable event, where the more probable event, in other words, didn't actually end up happening. And so let's consider some mitigating circumstances for these forecasts, some reasons why we should probably have expected those forecasts to come out somewhat differently than the result, or why we should have expected, the kinds of trouble that they, that the narrative says anyway, that they ran into. One thing to consider is that events that happen very late in an election are very, very hard for polls to measure because it takes time to conduct a poll. Right? I mean, you have to get the sample, you have to do all the interviews, you have to then get all that stuff together and collect it, analyze it, then publish it, right? And so there's always some lag. And so consider, for example, some of these graphics illustrating the effect of the Comey letter. If you don't remember what that was, you should definitely look that up. But if you look, go right to left here, if you look at the percentage of media coverage of Hillary Clinton that was sort of scandal related by week, okay, notice this is the week of the election, okay, and this is when the Comey letter came out. You'll notice there seems to have been an effect. Same thing with the tone of the media coverage, whether it was sort of favorable or unfavorable, right, to which candidate. And again, here's when the Comey letter comes out, and all of a sudden you see, notice where these dots are, okay? Notice right around here is when the Access Hollywood tape broke, and again, if you don't remember that one, you should look it up. And so you go from dots here, right, to dots here, and again, that absolutely may have an effect on an election in a way that would be very, very hard for polls, right, to have captured because it was so late in the election cycle. And in fact, in general, if you do these sort of word clouds with respect to media coverage of Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump, if you just sort of take, like the most common things, right? People, you just ask people what they've heard or read about, Hillary Clinton, what they've heard or read about Donald Trump. Notice here you get a lot of very, standard kinds of things that you would expect in somebody running, on a particular platform for a particular office. And then, of course, here you see, an entirely different story. And again, this is some of those circumstances are pretty interesting. And again, when things happen late in an election that could very well tip the events of the election, polls are not generally going to be able to consider those things because of the time it takes to conduct a poll. And so forecasts that are based on polls are then going to have that effect built into them as well. So here's another thing to consider for forecasts, right? When an electoral outcome is determined by just a few tens of thousands of votes out of 137 million total votes cast, I think we have to ask what kind of accuracy is reasonable to expect, right? How should you have expected anybody to accurately call the winner of an election where again 137 million votes are cast, but only a few tens of thousands in a few places really end up making the difference between which is the victor. So again, I think we have to be a little more generous there. And finally, let's talk about the polling accuracy in 2020, because again, the narrative seems to be that the polls were wrong again, or something like that. They were wrong in 16, they were wrong in 20. Polls suck, boo, right, or something like that. And the picture here is actually a little bit more nuanced. In some ways, the polls were actually a little bit worse in 2020 than they were in 2016, but in other ways, not so much. Again, if you want to look at a couple of pieces of infographic here, there were some big misses. So here's where the misses were the largest. Okay, but notice this is by far not everywhere. And that the degrees of these misses are sort of really bad in some places. Okay, like we're talking about like a -11 here. That's or a differential of 11. That's a lot. Okay, but a differential of 2 to 3 is actually not too bad at all. Those kinds of misses are well within the margin of error of most polls. So that's not so bad. And again, if we wanted to sort of update the kind of general polling error that we're used to seeing in presidential cycles, the 2020 error was actually it was greater than the 2016 error in terms of forecasting, say, the popular vote, but it wasn't that inaccurate by historical standards. And in fact, that 1980 election is one where the polls were really bad. And the polls in 2020 were twice as good as those. So yeah, they weren't perfect, but they weren't really super awful either. In fact, if you take a look at the difference between some of the presidential polls and then the results in key states, you'll notice, again, you'll see some, sort of like nationally it was further off than certainly in 2020 than it was in 2016. But if you look at, say, for example, in Arizona, the result was very, very close. I mean, within about roughly 0.5% off. That's really close. In Georgia, they were fairly close, just 1% and change off. Of course, Florida was off, but not way off. North Carolina was fairly close. Nevada was basically dead on. And so again, if you have to look holistically here, Pennsylvania, one of, very important state, was, the polls were dead on there, right? And so it's not like because they were wrong in some places, they were bad everywhere, or because the national poll was a little wronger than the national poll in 2018 was, doesn't mean it was necessarily bad in an absolute sense. So, polling accuracy in 2020, contrary to the narrative, was fairly usual in some ways, and very bad in some particular places. So if we want to talk about some of the places where it tended to get it right is, like after the sort of main election where the narrative again was, oh, the polls were terrible, the polls were awful. The polls of the Georgia race were, as you can see, very, very close to, they were close within a very reasonable degree of accuracy. As you can see, this is sort of a rolling polling average, right, over the course of the runoff to the runoffs, right? And these were the final poll estimates, and then these were the actual results after all the votes were counted, and you see they're pretty close. So one of the things that people very much wanted to talk about after this narrative that the polls were terribly wrong, which again, not necessarily, was the question, are there shy Trump voters making, is that what's going on here? And again, remember our discussion of sort of shy Tories, that is, shy voters from the previous lecture. And so a lot of research has sought to explain some of the larger polling misses and the sort of national overperformance of Republican votes in 2020 as compared with national polls. Patrick Murray, the director of the Monmouth University Polling Institute, puts it this way. He says, I'm a little less worried about the state of polling this time around than I was after Election Day 4 years ago, because we seem to have this phenomenon that whenever Donald Trump is on the ballot, and that's who we're asking about, that polling just seems to be off, right? And so he sort of hints at this idea that there's something about, right, that Trump as a candidate that has seemed to drive sort of more polling misses than you would think. And again, that's been a very much studied issue, the issue of whether there really are any shy Trump voters. And again, it's very, very hard to know for sure. And so far, most of the studies have not really found significant evidence of shy Trump voters, or if they have, they haven't found evidence that there are significantly more of those than there are shy Biden voters. That is, people who would not, say that they were voting for Biden, perhaps because they live in a place where, most of the people around them support Donald Trump, and so they might, they might even to a pollster say that, oh no, I'm undecided, or oh, I'm supporting Trump, when they in fact would vote otherwise. So again, some small number of people might be lying to pollsters here, but again, as far as we can tell, this doesn't really account for any of the trouble, or any substantial part of the trouble with the polls as they were. Instead, what seems to be going on is that there seems to have been a partisan response differential in the polls themselves. That is, when they make their calls, right, to sort of national canvassing, when they call all these sort of national numbers all over the place, the response rates are fairly low, right? Fairly few people answer their phones to talk to pollsters at all, and in fact that number is decreasing, as people tend not to answer any calls that come from numbers they don't recognize. And if you just take a look at what might be driving some of that partisan response differential in the sample, is some of the behaviors of candidates and individuals. So I just picked a couple of these data points here just to show some contrast. So for example, Donald Trump himself was quoted as saying this. He said, "We have poll numbers in Wisconsin where we're up 1, and yet I see ABC comes out, ABC Washington Post. Of course, they had us 12 down last time, and we ended up winning. So, one of those things, they're just suppression polls. It's a shame they can get away with it. If you think about it, it's almost like a campaign contribution to the DNC. The good news is our people understand it. They understand it very well. They went through it 4 years ago. It was actually worse 4 years ago." Now, the newspaper certainly edited this to make it look a little bit more sort of complete sentency, and I've sort of cut it and edited a little bit to sort of condense the thought here. But in general, Donald Trump said, was on the record as saying, tweeting lots of very negative things about polls and pollsters. He seemed to regard polling, if he was down in that polling, as a kind of criticism, or as a kind of opponent. And when really it's just simply public opinion research. There's no there's no agenda on the part of the vast majority of pollsters, and if there is, they're generally not very good pollsters. So that certainly may have had an influence on people's willingness to, if they knew they were being called by a pollster, whether they stayed on the line and actually filled out the poll, or whether they didn't. At the same time, we're also dealing with a pandemic where lots more people were working from home than usual. And an article from Vox put it this way. It said, in part due to COVID-19 stir craziness, Democrats, and particularly highly civilly engaged Democrats who donate to and volunteer for campaigns, have become likelier to answer polls. It's something to do when we're all bored, and it feels civically useful. Right. So again, if you had sort of an outsized positive opinion of pollsters, you might think, oh, I'd love to fill out I'd love to complete a poll. I'd love to answer some questions. Right. And it seems like, more civically involved Democratic voters were more likely to answer polls than civically engaged Republican voters. And again, part of that is because of the attitude of Trump himself toward polls and pollsters. And so that itself may have played some fairly reasonable role in some of the partisan response differential, and then in some of the lean that the biggest polling misses tended to have. And just to offer some extra evidence in support of that idea, right, that Trump's statements about polls, combined with the way that people on Democratic voters in general tended to view polls, just to add some credibility to that idea that could make a difference, consider the way that the phenomenon that was seen with mail-in voting in the 2020 election. Wired on April 30th of 2020, sort of, as people were really starting to talk about rolling out increased mail voting for, an election in the middle of a pandemic, had written this. They said in 1995, Oregon's Republican-controlled legislature passed a bill enacting vote at home. This is otherwise known as absentee voting or voting by mail, only to have it vetoed by Governor John Kitzhaber, a Democrat. Right? 3 years later, voters overwhelmingly approved the change through a ballot initiative. Many Democrats worried that it would help the other side. Absentee voting has long been a favorite of older, whiter, Republican-leaning voters. Phil Kiesling administered the transition to vote at home as Oregon's Secretary of State in the 1990s, and now chairs the National Vote at Home Institute, a nonpartisan organization that advocates expanding the reform. He recalled conversations with Democratic politicians who worried it'll help rural white voters and it won't help our base. It's a bad idea. Skittish Democrats saw confirmation of their fears in 2014 when, in Colorado's very first all-mail election, Republicans wiped out Democrats in statewide races. So this, again, there's historically, right, Republicans have tended to use absentee balloting, mail-in balloting much more effectively than Democratic voters have, right? And this is in a number of states who now, who have for some time done, all mail-in voting. Including some states in the Pacific Northwest and of course also Colorado. Again, historically, right, mail-in voting has been, has seen greater Republican participation than Democratic participation, just due to some demographic features that tend to be common nationally to Republican voters in some of these elections. But of course, if you were paying any attention at all, you'll notice that trend was quite reversed in 2020. Again, according to the Washington Post staff on October 8th, says one clear explanation of the growing gap has been well documented. Right, partisans often take cues from their party's elites, as scholarship has long found. When Trump criticizes voting by mail, as he frequently does, Republicans take note, and when other Republican politicians reiterate Trump's comments, the cue is made even more clear. And so you'll see that in quite a number of areas, there was a huge gap, right, between participation in mail-in voting between voters who voted for one party and voters who ended up voting for the other one. And that gap was tended to skew very heavily Democratic. Okay, so these are sort of absentee voting margins versus election day voting margins, again you can see some really significant issues here, and a lot of that is again down to the idea that what various leaders of a party say about a particular practice tends to affect the way that especially their most engaged voters will vote, right? And it tends to change the way they will behave. And so it might be plausible, after all, that saying lots of bad things about polls and pollsters will cause some people who support you not to answer polls, while having a generally good attitude toward polls and pollsters might cause some of the people who support you to sort of answer the polls more. Ultimately, it's the pollsters' problem to try and sort this out, but it's something that if it happens fairly quickly, then it's a trend that the pollsters can't actually correct until it's proven that it was a problem by leading to some polling misses here or there. Finally, let's take a look at some of the reasons why we shouldn't have necessarily expected forecasts in 2020 to be super awesome, even though most forecasters got it sort of directionally right, right? They tended to pick the winner that actually happened. But it was, not, I would say the election was closer than a lot of the forecast would have expected it to be. Now, part of the reason for that is that if you look at, say, this chart over here, it's that this was a very high turnout election. And part of the reason it was a high turnout election is because a lot of people really cared about the outcome. In fact, this is a chart showing the number of people who say on this line up here, it really matters who wins the presidential election versus things will be pretty much the same regardless of who is elected. Generally, when people are content, or more or less, contentment and apathy do sort of tend to go hand in hand. And so turnout tends to be lower, acrimony tends to be lower. If you just look at, say, just in the halcyon days of 2000, those many ages ago, pretty much, not that many people thought it was that important, who won the presidency. And, lots of people were like, it doesn't really matter. And to some extent, they were very likely correct. And so, but you'll notice that has been sort of, that increased a lot, right, over the course of, 4 years there, and some things may have caused that. So, September 11th, for example, comes to mind. But then, you'll see that that is just sort of, continued to increase as time has gone on. And now just about everybody thinks it really matters who wins the presidential election. Very few are convinced that, things are pretty much the same either way. So that tends to drive a lot of turnout. And when turnout is historically high, well, that makes things different than they have historically been. Okay, especially it affects the way that forecasts work because it changes the likely voter filter on poll samples. That is, you cannot rely so much on people's past voting behavior as a guarantee of whether they are more or less likely to vote in the future. Okay, and that means that when your likely voter model is a little off, that means that your projection is going to be a little off. It also requires a change in weighting procedures that can really only be appreciated once the election is over. Which groups have been turning out more, and so versus which groups have been answering polls more, etc. And that's something you can only learn retroactively. You can only learn after you've taken a whole set of polls, made some forecasts on that basis, and then seen how that does. And so you're always a little bit, one step behind the game when you're making these kinds of forecasts. And that's something that you should expect, right? You should expect some imprecision in forecasts for that very reason. And finally, why anybody should think that what is true of past elections would be true of an election in a massive pandemic is I think quite a reasonable question. So someone's like, oh gosh, the forecasts weren't perfect. It's like, well, gee whiz, I wonder why. Could it have something to do with all the kinds of things that just have never really happened before, that doesn't have a lot of historical precedence, and that would tend to, sort of make the most recent election a lot more unlike previous elections, which is what all of the forecasts are sort of based on trying to anticipate. Gee, I wonder. So again, given all that, I think the forecast probably, should be said to have done fairly well, and right along with the polls.